Please don't judge me too harshly. Burglars give people like me a bad name, though you might hear what I have to say and decide burglars are preferable. You wouldn't be the first. It's just a job to them, right? If you caught them off the clock, maybe you could grab a beer. I live in a tent in the woods next door to a gated community full of big houses that I wouldn't quite qualify as mansions, but are maybe 2 or 3 additions and a circle drive away, which they call Maple Heights. There aren't any maple trees on the grounds, and nobody calls it that, but it's what's on the signs. My tent is maybe 20 feet from a gap in the fence, hidden in a thicket of dead vines and tangled shrubbery. Apparently, it would kill the tent manufacturers to make something that wasn't neon. But even still, you can hardly see it unless you know what you're looking for. All of the plant matter is woven together so densely that I barely even need one. The fence is old, as old as the housing development. Its planks are dark, covered in slick moss and lichen, and it's tall, maybe 20 feet, for privacy, right? And there is a big road on the far side of the lot. I'll allow them that. But at a certain point, it just starts to look more like you're anticipating some sort of barbarian invasion. Maybe they are. Anyways, the wood is old, like I said, and worn and dark. And you can see where they've replaced it over the years, a board here or a section there. But it looks like this post must have been uprooted in a storm, leaving it leaning at a slight angle, resting against the adjacent section at the top, and creating a triangular gap at the ground, maybe 4 feet high. It's the sort of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking from a very specific angle. I only have to squat a little and turn sideways to shimmy through. You are in someone's backyard as soon as you do, and it's almost a shock to the system how wide open and empty it is to go from all those trees to all that sky and grass. So I limit myself to nighttime crossings. That's when everyone is home anyways. There are some stay-at-homes and work-from-homes, to be sure, but for the most part, during the day, people take the drama of their lives out into the world, into their shops and offices and cafes, into the cities and onto the streets. Out there, I am on display, or at least I was when I lived there, or people would walk through my bedroom without even acknowledging my existence. Let me take you through my setup, in case you are listening to this tape and you are not the one who found it for some reason. My humble little abode. Sorry if that's too self-deprecating. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. Mostly folks use that phrase at least a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I must have said it 50 times when we bought our 6-bed, 3.5 bath outside in Kensington. Whenever anyone would come over for the first time, I'd give them the tour, the in-ground pool, finished basement, jacuzzi, and the master bath. Sometimes I want to reach through time and slap myself in the face. Sometimes I want to so bad that I do it to my current self instead, and it still feels pretty good. You ever notice how certain words are only ever used if there are other specific words around them? You think anyone's ever given a quick housewarming tour of their grand abode? On the floor here is my sleeping bag. There's my battery lantern for emergencies only. It's all woods around here. Theoretically, there shouldn't be any roads or houses that would be able to see me. lit up like a beacon, but I don't like to risk it regardless. Here's my Gatorade water bottle. I should replace that soon. I've got my jacket over here in this corner, a few changes of clothes, enough to bundle up and use as a pillow at night. I like to keep my shoes on this little towel here by the entrance so that it doesn't get too dirty in here. It doesn't always work, but I try my best to keep it clean. I've got this little hand broom. There's my radio. There's my backpack in the other corner with just about everything else I own in the world inside. I keep a roll of toilet paper near the entrance, an old shopping bag for garbage. Outside here, there's an old camp chair I found in a dumpster that still works perfectly fine. It's forest green. Otherwise, I don't like to keep too many things outside. An old rug someone put out to the curb makes things feel a little homier. A shopping cart that I found nearby that I figure will come in handy for something someday. And finally, my bike that I'm still trying to find a few parts to repair. I made a crossing last night. I don't know when I'll be going back, truth be told. But look at me. It's like a drug. Just thinking about it is making my heart race a little faster. The process, the ritual. Some days I feel like all I do is sit around waiting for the sun to set. That first moment, that first step onto the short manicured grass. So soft. I can feel my body come to life. My pupils dilate. My hair stand on end. Some cold liquid seems to seep down the length of my spine until every muscle feels twitchy and agile and potent, like I could climb the fence if I really had to. The air even tastes different over there. I take a moment to let it fill my lungs. Suddenly, I am in the suburbs. The woods sound like they are 10 miles away, and they feel even farther. I'm in the Jimersons' backyard. I know this because they don't have a lock on their mailbox. Sometimes it's fun to invent these details. And there are always, connective threads that I need to fill in for myself. But you'd be amazed how much more immediate the drama of someone's life feels when you learn their name. They become someone rather than just anyone. Alas, the Jimersons are currently on vacation. See? If I was a burglar, how could I resist? If I was even sympathetic to their lot, I could have shared this very valuable information with one of them, probably stand to take a decent cut of that loot for myself. It's a finder's fee. But I'm not. And I didn't. In fact, when I noticed that some of Mrs. Jimerson's flower beds were looking a bit wilted, I gave them a quick watering with the hose. But I couldn't contain myself for long. I made it to the sidewalk without anyone seeing me as far as I could see, and then was able to just start walking like I owned the place. It was a delicious night. The air was such a perfect temperature that I never even thought about it until the thought occurred to me. It was never for 1 second an iota too warm or too cold. How about that? In all the big wide universe, in the vastness of time, here I was on a planet, on a day, in a spot where the outside was in such perfect harmony with my insides that the barrier and distinction almost melted away entirely. It was such a state that even the occasional cool little breeze was enough to thrill me. My skin was like the surface of a still pond that ripples and shimmers and takes on a whole new texture. I passed a lawn full of kids playing kick the can or ghost in the graveyard or something like that. Lots of running and squealing. I came to a corner house with an open garage, a dome light burning in the driveway car. Heads moving between the headrests. I came to the other side and saw the open door. Then the front door opened, and a man came out and retrieved the children. When he noticed me, he flashed me a tight-lipped smile and locked the car before heading back inside. I turned at the intersection and walked up the block, then right again at the next street, and went until I found a couple of houses side by side that looked dark and safe with decent tree cover. I checked to make sure that there was nobody around and quietly slipped between them. Between backyards, I doubled back the way I'd come, through some sparse woods, until I found the corner house, all lit up and pulsing with life. There must have been at least a dozen windows, and only one was dark. Standing at the edge of the yard, I could hear noises from inside. Laughter, yelling, a dog barking. As long as they don't let him outside, I thought, though I had an evening ruined by a barking dog at a window once before. The neighbor to the left had their kitchen lights on, though I could see nobody inside, and an upstairs light on behind an opaque curtain. To the right, the only light was the blue flickering of a TV behind a far downstairs window. I waited one extra moment to make sure that the way was clear, and then, ducking a bit, hurrying but not rushing, made my way across the open ground, past a gazebo and a trickling little fountain, hopped over a flower bed, and pressed myself flat against the wall of the house. I focused on my breathing, on catching my breath and keeping it quiet. I turned around. There was nobody behind me. I waited and listened for any changes that might indicate that someone had seen me, but everything seemed to be proceeding as it had been. My heart came to heel, though it still beat a little faster for the excitement. I listened to the sound of the crickets and the frogs and the river rush of traffic flowing by on the main road a mile or so to the east. A blinking plane was passing silently overhead amongst the stars, making and breaking new constellations as it went. I shifted my feet and felt the soil give beneath my sneakers, the day's heat still radiating from the brick. I smelled the night fragrance, filled my lungs, then closed my eyes, and melted into all of it. I gave myself, body and mind, to the night, and became as the shadow of a cloud passing in front of the moon. It sounds crazy to say such a thing in the daylight, or even out loud. But in those moments, in which I really believed that I was invisible, in the deepest part of me, because I wasn't even thinking about it, I was only feeling it. In those moments, I think that in some ways, I might really have been. And there are multiple specific instances that I can reference, which led me to think so. I remember, as a child, summers, playing all day with all of the other kids in the street, over and across the yards, front and back, up and down the block, rushing home when my mom rang the bell from the porch for dinner, or when the street lamps came on. Some nights, rushing back out the door after dessert, root beer floats, malts if Grandma and Grandpa came over from across town with their malt machine, to rejoin the other kids and the lightning bugs in the streets and on the lawns in the fading twilight, which stirred something in our chests, thrilled us, reinvigorated us, as if the day's energy had drained right into our thumping little hearts. And you fell 10 times as fast. Like your feet were barely touching the ground. Like if you ran any faster, you might float away entirely. We were playing hide and seek, the lot of us. Maybe 20 in all that night, which was typical. I noticed a low, strong-looking, barren branch on a big oak tree and made up my mind. I wasn't the strongest climber, but something came over me and I was up in the canopy in under a minute. I took another to find the perfect spot and was settling in when I heard the seeker down the street finishing their counting. I was quite confident in my hiding spot from the jump, but when the seeker started seeking, I realized what a vantage point I had discovered as well. It was like a whole new game. I was used to hiding in sheds, maybe with a few others. That was where my instincts usually led me. Tight, dark nooks and crevices and such, and safety in numbers, suppressing giggles whenever we heard the seeker coming near. But this, I knew where several of my friends had hid and could see a few of their spots from my perch. The rush of watching the seeker stumble around, blindly groping, desperately calling out the names of her friends, without the slightest inclination that she was being observed, that I was right above her, that all she'd have to do was look up, and she never would. It was intoxicating. I watched as she picked them off one by one, heard the laughter and the screaming. Nobody had seen me climb the tree that I knew of. It came down to the last few. They all had found good spots, and this seeker wasn't the greatest to begin with. Eventually, a few of the other kids were enlisted to help. A few people protested, but soon more of them grew impatient and joined. They found most of them, and when they found the last, there was an extended argument because Gil claimed that Kevin knew where he was hiding and had told one of the seekers. I admit that he did seem to have a case. But as they argued, people started to become bored. And then Michaela piped up that nobody had found me yet. And this caught the attention of all the bored people, and soon everyone else too, as they all joined in on trying to solve the mystery of where I was hiding. When I tell you, my cheeks ached from smiling so wide and for so long. The glee came over me in waves. It was everything I could do not to cry out. It felt like all of that ecstasy needed to go somewhere. Once, completely mystified, Eric H. came right up beneath me to the trunk of the tree I was in and just looked around the other side of it, as if I might have just been standing behind it the whole time. I still can't believe I didn't burst out laughing at that one. People were crisscrossing the street up and down the block, calling out my name. I realized that at some point I would have to come out, make my grand re-entrance, or else what would have been the point, you know, if nobody could see what a great hiding spot I'd found, if I couldn't bask in my triumph in front of them. But there just never seemed to come a natural climax. I couldn't bring myself to put an exclamation point anywhere. I could have sat there all night, but unfortunately nobody was interested in looking for me that long. Eventually they stopped looking in earnest and in good spirits and started complaining and whining for me to come out already and insisting that the game was over. Well, it clearly wasn't over, was it? Here I was, still at large, but for some of them that didn't matter. It was over regardless. People soon started to give up, one at a time or in pairs at first, but soon a few bigger chunks of kids did, and then the original seeker, and then there were only a few diehard boys left out searching for me, more out of spite than anything it seemed, and now I couldn't come down. The moment had passed. And besides, why should I show them this great spot I'd found? Why shouldn't I keep it to myself? Eventually, the last of them quit and went home, and I was alone. That was when I looked up and noticed the light in the window behind me. It hadn't been on when I first climbed the tree. I'd have noticed it. In the dark, I hadn't realized how close to the house I actually came. And to my great shock, there was someone in the window. It was a woman I had never seen before. Or if I had, I hadn't known it. She was on the younger end, maybe in her 30s. And by the time I saw her, she'd already taken off whatever top she was wearing and was standing there in her bra and pants. The tree cover was so thick that I imagine, being on the second floor, she maybe didn't feel the need to draw the curtains for a quick change. She certainly made no sign that she had noticed me and wriggled out of her pants. My head started to feel very light and a little dizzy. My limbs tingled. I thought I might float right off the branch I was sitting on. She removed her bra and spent a brief moment admiring herself in the mirror, checking out this or that spot on her person for closer inspection. I knew that it could not last long and fully expected it to end at any moment, so each second longer that she stood there felt like a lifetime. She had dark brown hair and a birthmark above her left breast. Eventually, she redressed in her pajamas and turned off her light as she left the room. But still, I couldn't move. Not until I heard my mom calling my name. She was very far away at first, by our house, her voice barely enough to rouse me from the stupor I was in. But the next thing I knew, she was right below me, looking right up at me. I nearly leapt out of the tree. But I explained and climbed down. On the short walk home, I asked her how she had known where I was hiding. She said that she saw the color of my shirt, that from whatever particular angle she had been viewing the tree from, I was perfectly visible, through a little gap or a thinner section in the foliage. She'd just been scanning the environment and noticed me up there, plain as can be. So no, I don't think it's purely sexual, as some have suggested. At least not for me, since I'm sure you've already beat me to the analysis. Maybe you might argue it was what stamped the experience onto my consciousness so emphatically, or something, but I don't know. I'd ask you what 12-year-old boy sitting on the same branch that I was wouldn't have looked. Likewise, it was clear to see, even in passing, that this was an attractive couple here in the corner house. Young parents, still in the absolute throes of life, right in the thick of it, exhausted and radiant with it. Together, just the two of them, and all the more ferociously in love with one another for it. You could tell by the way they spoke and interacted. Life was still something to be attacked with verve. What adult with a functioning nervous system wouldn't take a chance to at least take a peek if the opportunity was right there, if nobody would ever know? Go ahead. Swear your denials up and down. Perform them for all to see. Make sure those in the back can hear. Easier to just cast me out for being honest. But there was nothing so lascivious happening, you'll be disappointed to hear. At least not while I was there. Look. I'm sorry to be so castigating. I don't know why I'm like this sometimes. Maybe it's because I spend most of my time with myself, and I can be quite cutting with him. I talk to so few others these days that I don't know how to act right when I do. Look, I wanted to see them naked too. The dad sat on the couch, drinking a Coke and watching a sitcom I didn't recognize. He seemed to watch the commercials exactly as intently as he watched the show. The mom stood at the stove, cooking broccoli and chicken thighs and small potatoes. She talked while she cooked to the two boys sitting behind her at the kitchen table who raced small cars all over its surface. A comfortable scene, to be sure, but perhaps not what I was after. At least not right now. They were still performing, even if only for each other. But my blood was hot and running fast. I was looking for real vulnerability, real honesty, something completely unadorned and unaffected. I moved along. I backtracked through the woods, looking for signs of life. The moon was rising higher in the sky. It was a cloudless night. The sky was a very dark blue, and the glow of the moon seemed excessively bright, excessively sharp, like looking at a bare light bulb. I did my best to avoid the crunchiest looking leaves, didn't snap any large twigs or branches. The pine needles covered the ground like drifts of snow. My limbs felt live, the air cool and crisp in my nostrils. I caught sight of a guy in a high little kitchen window washing the dishes. At that point in the night, I was willing to investigate anything, so I stayed put and watched from the tree line until he moved, and then I made my way up to the house. There was a cobblestone patio with sliding glass doors and a bay window. I could see him sitting at a desk, working on a computer. I couldn't see from my angle what he was looking at, but his face seemed twitchy and agitated. He kept hanging his head and rubbing the bridge of his nose or his temples. And sometimes he would run his hands through his hair or take a deep breath and try to sort of reset, as it were. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up, went to the center of the room where there was a rug, pushed the coffee table there up against the couch, and used it to lower himself to the ground. He did push-ups for several minutes. I didn't count, but he must have done at least 50 or 60. He stopped, rose to his knees, put one hand on the coffee table to stabilize himself while he caught his breath, then went back down for 50 or 60 more. He repeated this cycle 6 more times, and then collapsed onto the floor and began to cry. He cried for at least as long as he had spent doing push-ups, and then at some point I realized he had fallen asleep. He looked like he might remain there until morning, so I moved on. I stopped at several more houses which appeared promising, and at each of them I found nothing but people sitting on their couches or at their kitchen tables or laying in their beds looking at their phones. Which is fine, I suppose. I'm not casting aspersions. It just doesn't make for very good theater. I left through the front gate and went across the street to an older development from the 50s or 60s. It was growing later, and there were more ranch houses here, which meant more bedrooms on the ground level as people retired for the evening. Down a side road, I stumbled onto a family of deer grazing who seemed as surprised to see me. They stopped eating to watch as I shuffled past. I spotted light leaking from behind a curtain in a window on a nearby house and changed course to investigate. I crouched down to achieve the best angle, which took advantage of the carelessly drawn curtain. A man was lying on the bed, touching himself. I walked away. It happens sometimes. You can't let it ruin your night. A fisherman doesn't get mad at all of the starfish and other crap that come up in his net. He just tosses them back. Why had starfish specifically come into my mind? I trudged through backyards looking for signs of life. You think you have a solid mental gestalt of what the human form is supposed to look like, but every now and then you catch a glimpse of a naked body that blows it up entirely. I actually heard the life before I saw it. I was in one of those thin strips of woods that they'd left to keep the rows of houses separate. Dark clouds were lingering in front of the moon, and I couldn't make out much beyond my next few steps. Someone in one of the houses all the way down at the other end of the block screamed. I moved fast, but tried to move quietly toward it, so that I would be ready to hear it if it happened again. I was meanwhile trying to replay the initial scream in my mind, break it down into its constituent elements so that I might decide if it was a scream of laughter, of playfulness, or of real distress, of anguish, or even terror. It was certainly loud, that I'd heard it from where I'd heard it. If it was serious, it would be serious. I tried to move as fast as I could and still keep my breathing steady. Then it came again, a little closer, less muffled, like it was outside now. It was a child's voice, followed by laughter and another scream, and then some shouts from other children. Then I heard crashing coming through the woods not far ahead of me, which brought the voice into the material world, gave it weight, which was headed toward me. It turned my stomach in knots that I could hear the child, probably smell him if I really tried. I could sense him in my world, my sphere of tangibility. But my eyes could not catch up, could not provide their own confirmation, which was the only one I really cared about. I stood perfectly still. The other voices gave chase. The boy screamed again, and I was not prepared for how close he was, and my whole body jolted like a flag snapped back around the pole of my spine in hurricane winds. I tried to be as a tree. I stood straight and made my back into a trunk and tried to think tree thoughts. I couldn't see the boy, but I could hear his sneakers swishing through the dead leaves. I was dumbstruck by the thought that he might very well run straight into me. There was a non-zero chance. I wanted to move, duck behind a tree or something, now that I could hear better to tell the angle from which he was approaching, but I thought that the movement might only be worse for me at that point. I closed my eyes for a second. I told myself to hide the whites from him should they catch a stray bit of starlight and glint at an inopportune moment. But it was a fear response, plain and simple, and I reopened them a moment later. He passed me and kept going. I could hear his friends coming too, but they were farther off. A few moments later, he doubled back and came past again, a few feet closer than before even, off to my right, and then paused. I held my breath. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He was somewhere just back over my shoulder. I feared that even turning my head to look would give me away, so I tried to sense if he had seen me or sensed something himself. The moment was certainly charged, but was any of that coming from him? Was the tension entirely within me? Was he only catching his breath? A second later, maybe it was 5 minutes, he took off running and rejoined his friends. Kids are far too quick to screaming, if you ask me. When you grow up, you realize it's a serious tool meant for serious occasions. They teach them in school not to pull the fire alarm, don't they? The crying. Someone should have told these boys about the wolf. Another scream. This one male. Pained but aggressive. I saw the silhouettes of a handful of boys skittering toward the house where it had come from. They gathered beneath a bay window, peering in a corner and snickering. When they moved on, I made my approach. There was a teenage boy inside, maybe high school age, maybe older, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. Every few seconds, at odd intervals, his body would convulse. The room was suffused with the blue glow of the television, a big flat screen, maybe even 60 inches, with a web of cracks covering maybe 80% of its face. There was a video game console on the floor near the middle of the room, the cords strewn. One of the plastic plates had been jarred loose and was lying alongside. The game controller lay at the foot of the TV stand. The kid on the couch started punching himself in the temple. His was the reddest I'd ever seen a human face. He started writhing around on the couch and soon became entangled in a blanket, and then, in trying to disentangle himself, fell to the floor, where he started thrashing around and slamming his fist into the hardwood. He looked like he might claw the skin right off his face. But eventually he wore himself out and lay panting on the floor where he was, still half entangled. After a couple of minutes, he stood up and turned off the light and moved to another room, and I moved to another house. A few blocks over, a married couple was howling at one another. All the screaming. I could understand maybe every third thing they said. They kept moving back and forth between rooms, up and down the stairs. Once she went into the basement yelling and came up with a basket of laundry at her hip, still yelling. Something about her mother being offended that he didn't like her chicken, though maybe that was something one of them had brought up along the way. Who knew what had started it? I thought it highly unlikely that either of them did. I traipsed around a bit more, rather aimlessly, and ended up in an area I'd never been. The street I was on dead-ended in an empty cul-de-sac, just a lone lamp, the orange sodium vapor kind. Isn't it strange that that's how the night is supposed to look? It doesn't seem real any other way, does it? Maybe it's like seeing by fire, seeing like our ancestors saw the night. When you put up those white lights, I start to feel disoriented, like I'm walking on the surface of the moon or the floor of the ocean, like we've stolen or fabricated a piece of the day and built a safe little submarine from it, from whence we can move safely along the hostile alien surface that is the night. But I can't help but wonder what we're missing that way. What sort of stuff is lurking in the shadows outside of our carefully crafted capsules? There was a sign beneath the street lamp that said, "No dumping." A second one said, "No cruising." Someone might ask them who dumped those ugly signs there. There was a mostly dried up looking marshy area behind the pavement, and then some sort of settlement beyond that, another smudge of artificial light blotting the horizon. I was in an explorative mood. I marched through the high grasses and over the spongy clumps, matted and fanned like scales over the landscape. I heard the earth squelching and tried to keep a thick layer of dry grass between my shoes and the mud. Halfway across, I turned and saw that the neighborhood I'd left was beginning to look as paltry and as arbitrary as the hamlet I was headed toward had from the cul-de-sac, while still being clearly much larger in scale. Some deep part of my chest, back through my shoulders, ached for the cover of the woods. The clouds had cleared and the moon was shining on little strips of standing water amongst the reeds, which I had to zigzag to avoid. I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the cul-de-sac watching me, or else stepping off the pavement to follow me. Sometimes I think that my mind will play tricks on me just to stay sharp. You ever seen a dog roll a ball down a hill just to go and chase after it? Who? Just someone. A figure. A boogeyman. Bogeymen. Bogmen. Wouldn't that be something? To enter the realm of Leonardo, Lenin, John, and Vlad, I suppose. Lucy the Neanderthal, the guy who painted those caves in France. To live forever. People of immense talent and wealth and import and fame who toiled their entire lives will die the second death and be forgotten forever, their names never uttered again, while I am perchance discovered, preserved by some future race, 500 years hence, 5,000, by some unrecognizable peoples, a shorthand for all my kind, all who lived in this town, in this century, for all who walked on two legs on this continent, in this millennia. I wonder what they might name me. Think of the man hours spent imagining my life, my last hours. It would be a kind of immortality. I wonder if any of the other Bogmen's thoughts wandered in this direction during their final moments. Hell, even a nice case in the little town history museum would be fun. Would probably make the local news. It wouldn't be nothing. How long does it take a human body to mummify? Goes to show how much of our lives we spend lost inside of our own heads, though. Completely disengaged with everything around us. Watch what happens to all of your plans for next week when you slip and fall through the peat and the water's up above your ears. Are you going to grab onto coffee on Tuesday to pull yourself out? Maybe that passive-aggressive thing your boss said last week? Growing up, my friend Eric Lonsdale lived by a park where several men in the neighborhood liked to practice their chipping and short game. And sometimes we would find the balls that they left under the trees and in the weeds and tall grass, and we would hit them with a baseball bat over the tall privacy fence and onto the freeway below. there was no point from which we could see the road, so we had to rely on the sound of the traffic. We almost never heard any change or interruption, but that didn't make it any less thrilling. If anything, we were secretly relieved. It was a bit like playing Russian roulette, if Russian roulette involved handing someone a gun and placing them at the center of a circle of people and spinning them around until they were too dizzy to see straight. There was one time, though. One time, I made really good contact with it. Oh, why did it have to be me? The whole thing was Eric's idea in the first place. It was his house. We did what he said. It felt pure in my hands, leaving the bat. And I caught one glimpse of the ball in the sky. It flashed in the sun and was gone. But I could tell by its trajectory that it was bound for the road. We heard tires screeching. I felt them screeching in my stomach. And then there was another sound, more staccato, like a pop, and we ran. Eric ran first. I was frozen, but the sight of him leaving me behind put some motion into my legs. We ran until the breath burned in my lungs. Neither of us knew where we were running. We weren't running anywhere, just away, trying to outrun the feeling, the hot fuzzy numbness seeping out of my stomach. We ended up behind a Walgreens, gasping, walking along through a bog. Sorry about that. As I was saying, walking through a bog, driving home from work. The earth disappears beneath your feet. From one moment to the next, your car is moving in another direction. Shattered windshield, can't see, still doing 80. One of those memories that just seems to burble up every few years to haunt me, who knows why. Wake up in a cold sweat. Once, I dreamt that I was the one driving the car. Eric was sure that the sound we heard was a car crashing, maybe into the median. I wasn't so sure. It wasn't nearly as loud as you would expect. In fact, I was barely even sure that we heard it at all, or that it wasn't just like a trailer hitting a bump or something. We went by the park later, keeping our distance to see if the police were there or anything like that, but they weren't. It looked like it did every other day. Watch out for the wolf, I thought. I imagined the snidest 10-year-old boy's face I could muster, surrounded by his chortling friends. Didn't your parents ever warn you? There's no wolves in these woods. Not for 100 years. Have you ever lost an argument with yourself? I'm not a wolf. I'm not even a citizen. You won't even have to see me the next day while you're out shopping for groceries. I don't move among you by design. It's for everyone's benefit, believe me. I'm merely an observer. And isn't that all you ever asked for, after all? An audience? Someone to validate your life? To give meaning to all of the mundane little things you spend your days doing? Don't let me interrupt the performance, please. I have to laugh that there is anyone out there still asking about trees falling in the woods when there are 1,000 videos uploaded to the internet every minute that will never receive a single view. You might loathe the thought of me out here in the woods, lurking like a grub on the underside of things. But wouldn't it take a much bigger psychopath to watch someone change and cry about their dead mom and then go have a normal conversation with them the next day? On the other side of the marshy area, I found myself in a trailer park. The lone light was coming from a work lamp on a telephone pole with a transformer that appeared to be overloaded with a tangled web of all manner of wires going every which way at the center of another cul-de-sac, up on a hill at the end of a spur road. There were a half dozen trailers, and the nearest had an elevated back deck with a trellis and a red striped umbrella and a couple of sagging outdoor chairs next to a rusty leg curl machine. There were no lights on. I was about to walk right past it when some instinct told me to stop. I reassessed the trailer. There was something off about it. It did not feel as empty as I had presumed it to be on the first glance. I snuck up to a window and looked inside. There was a patch of moonlight on the floor in the same shape as the window. Otherwise, the interior was as dark as the exterior. Then I saw the cherry of a cigarette. There was a man sitting on a low couch against the wall to my left. Ice water poured into my veins. He reached for a bottle of liquor on the coffee table in front of him and drank. I waited and did not move. He wiped his mouth and returned the bottle and resumed staring straight ahead. He seemed to be looking at the door. Some of the tension left my shoulders. There was little else in the room. A rug, a small painting on the wall, no TV. He did not have a book or anything, wasn't looking at his phone, just smoking, drinking now and then, and watching the door. As far as I could tell, he was alone. He seemed like he might be about my age, but the only time I ever even had half a decent look at him, he was lighting one of his cigarettes. Same color hair, too, but dressed in a collar and slacks. He didn't seem too happy or sad or bored or tired or agitated or anything, really. Across the way was a double wide with every window all aglow. There was a big mailbox out front with the address spelled out on kids' blocks. I crossed the circle of asphalt to where they had planted petunias around the mailbox and listened to see if I could hear what was happening inside. None of the other trailers appeared to be occupied. Most appeared long unoccupied. I watched the front door of the double wide, worried that it might open at any moment. There was a basketball hoop to my left, the rim drooping like it didn't want to play. An owl spoke from a nearby spruce tree. I think. I couldn't see it. I made a wide loop around to the side of the trailer where the shadows were dense but the window was too tall to see through. With one last thorough check to make sure that there were no neighbors who might spot me, no cars coming just down the road, I crept out into the front yard, leaving shoe prints in the flower bed. There was a foul, vaguely sour stench to the place. The windows were all covered with blinds, the standard sort you'd find in any office, but the blinds of one were so beat up and bent out of shape near the bottom as to provide a fairly substantial gap to look through. There were people inside, that much was apparent immediately. There wasn't much else. It was one big room, and the floor was an off-white tile, the same sort I remember from every multi-purpose room at every school I ever attended. There was a plain white clock on the wall, which also reminded me of school, a fire extinguisher beneath it, and a poster of the periodic table of elements on the opposite wall with one dog-eared corner. There was someone sitting on a metal folding chair in the center of the room, engulfing it, or nearly anyways, to be more accurate. I don't mean to be rude. I just don't know how else to state what I saw. It was one of the largest people I've ever seen in my life. And the chair was so nearly enveloped that it was one of the last things I saw, to tell you the truth. It took me a moment to figure out what was supporting them. And once I did, I never figured out how exactly it was. They didn't move for as long as I watched. Sat there with their hands in their lap, surrounded by 9 babies, by my count. Not newborns, perhaps toddlers would be more accurate. Most were not walking, but weaned. They sat on the floor all around the room, some alone and some in groups. There were white babies and black babies and olive babies and a few in between, all in diapers, naked otherwise. Some sucked on pacifiers, some on bottles. A few had toys, plastic rings, and stuffed animals. They clapped or smashed them on the tile and giggled and toppled over and crawled to sit in some other part of the room. The guardian in the middle did not move, an older, middle-aged man whose amber-rimmed glasses harkened back to the 70s. A blonde-orange goatee denoted the location of his chin. His eyes were vacant, staring straight ahead at nothing which I could discern. Some of the babies just sat with their hands at their sides, looking at their peers. One had the hiccups. A roving cockroach maneuvered a path between them. There was something strange in the guardian's face. Something snagged in my periphery, but I couldn't even say what it was when I looked directly at him. 3 of the babies were gathered in the far corner, huddled around a tablet that had been leaned against the wall. Images flashed across the screen, which I couldn't make heads or tails of. As soon as I thought I'd even wrapped my brain around what it was gone, replaced by another, washing the children's complexions in a rainbow strobe. They were entranced, unblinking. They did not see the cockroach moving behind them. One sat with a puddle of drool between his legs. The bug approached, a small blond boy who removed his pacifier and tilted his head to greet it. The bug waggled its antenna at him. Strange symbols burned on the screen, pictures that made no sense. Then they cut out and the screen went black and stayed that way, like the battery was dead. The girl nearest reached for it and knocked it over onto its face. The third child, a curly-haired boy, easily the biggest of the three, screamed and staggered uncertainly to his feet. He pushed her aside and grabbed the tablet himself. He fell to the floor and took it with him. He shook and pawed at it to no effect. The screen was dead. He screamed again. The guardian sat stock still. I could not even perceive his breathing. The screaming child raised the tablet as high as he could in both hands and slammed it once onto the ground. Then he turned to the girl. His eyes were burning with hatred. The bug moved onto another boy, pale-complected, sucking on a toy train. The bug took one tentative step upon his toe and then felt his way swiftly up the chubby leg, a few rings of fat smushed together, to his stomach. The large boy with the curly hair roared and reared back with the tablet and smacked the girl across the face. She fell backwards, crying. The guardian did not even turn his head. I had never seen anyone so large. It was difficult to make out where his arms even began, where his torso ended. He had no neck. It was as if he'd been poured into place. The cockroach crawled over the little boy's head. The girl was crying, screaming, retching. The boy with the curly hair raised the tablet again. I could see that the screen was cracked. He cracked it again atop her skull, and then a third time. Some of the other babies turned to watch. One who could stand a little bit did so, and took 2 steps forward towards the scene like he was going to help, and then he fell over and struggled to right himself again like a turtle. The cockroach crawled over the boy's face. He tossed the train aside. He tried to grab the bug and couldn't manage. He rolled over onto his back in the effort. The bug clung steadily to the saddle. He moved his antenna in rhythm, caressing the child's lips. The girl wheezed and coughed and screeched. The curly-haired boy hit her again. A bit of blood appeared on the screen. She tried in vain to crawl away. He hit her 2 more times. I looked at the guardian. His eyes were open. Not a muscle on his face was out of place. He stared straight ahead at the same patch of nothing. The curly-haired boy bared his teeth and hit the girl again, square in the forehead, and she was still. He stood over her, panting, his small chest heaving with rage. The cockroach parted the boy's lips and slipped inside. The guardian did not move. There was something unnameable wrong with his face. There was nothing at all behind his eyes, but something was moving behind his lips, in the darkness of his mouth, something glistening wet, maybe a tongue, but it was black. And as soon as I noticed it, was the moment that it stopped. One of the smaller babies was crawling toward him. In trying to pull himself up onto the chair, he slipped and nudged it just a bit, but enough to shift the chair half an inch and set the guardian swaying ever so slightly, like a tower of jello. His glasses had fallen down on his nose, and he made no effort to fix them. In fact, his entire face had shifted, barely, but I'd stared at it so long that it seemed glaring. It was now fixed in this new position. It was a mask. Finally, he moved. His back right flank sort of pulsed beneath his shirt. Not a body part I've ever seen anyone else move independently. I suddenly felt very sick in my stomach and very hot in my face. What was this horrific lump? A fire truck toy had caught the attention of the child nearest it, and he was pulling himself along the aluminum supports of the chair. His small red hands slipped again, and he fell forward. His left hand landed on the tile directly beneath the seat, and it gave way with no resistance, opening like a trash can lid. The baby caught himself and crawled to the truck. The tile swung back and forth a few times before resettling into place. I heard the door to the trailer across the way behind me swing open and slam shut. I'll never know if it was the man I'd seen earlier or if he saw me. I took off, running. It was late and the air was cold and burned my throat. The moon was low and yellow and crossed by inky black cloudlings. It's been many years since I felt that fast. I never made it to sleep. I've been in my tent all morning, but the sun is above the trees and starting to bake in here. I don't feel safe in the woods anymore. I don't know if I feel safe anywhere. I don't know what I saw, but I know that some tangled branches and a ski of nylon will not be enough to let me sleep anytime soon. I don't think I'm going to look in any more windows. There's someone outside. It sounds like a man. Nobody has ever come this close before, not to my knowledge. But I don't think he's noticed me. He's over by the fence, near the hole, hammering. I'm glad he's here.